Now, I'd like to think that the more I do photography, then the more I'm going to be able to eliminate mistakes from my work. But the reality is that even after 15 years working as a photographer, I still have to catch myself to stop myself from making mistakes that I've made before, and the kind of mistakes that you only really notice when you get home and you look at them, you look at the images on the screen and you think to yourself, oh yeah, I really shouldn't have done that. So while I do still make mistakes while I'm shooting, I do think that I've got quite a bit better at catching them. And one of the best ways that I find for doing that is that reminding myself whenever I'm out shooting to ask myself questions. What are the mistakes that I've made before that I could be making now? Are there things that I've done wrong before that I didn't need to be aware of? And usually just by asking myself a question like that can be enough to make me realize that I'm missing something important. So these are some of the most common mistakes that I've caught myself making in the past, and also things that I see coming up quite often when I'm leading workshops. Now, compositionally, it can sometimes be quite easy to be distracted by something in the scene that grabs your attention that is so cool, like you've got a really colorful sky, an amazing sunset, or some really good light. And you feel, because it's so cool, you feel compelled to include that in the image, even though it's not really harmonious, it doesn't really balance, it doesn't support the main subject or the main focal point of your image. So you can end up with unbalanced compositions. And you can see in these images here, I was so fixated by the color in the sky that I tried to force a composition and ended up with messy images that don't really balance because the color in the sky is kind of off on one corner. It's just the leading lines are all wrong and there's just too much negative or empty space. Or here where I wanted to get the moving water in the foreground, but I knew it wasn't really working because it was making the waterfall in the back too small and the rocks on the side just dominated too much. But I kept persevering even though I kind of knew in the back of my head that it wasn't going to work and I should have just walked away and done something else. Or here where I wanted to get the moving waters in the foreground in the frame so much that I was kind of ignoring the fact that it really unbalanced the composition because the water was leading you away from the actual focal point and acting more as a distraction than a support. So the point is sometimes to understand that not everything has to go in a frame. You really have to consider if certain elements, even if they're really impressive, even if they look really, really cool, if they're supporting the actual composition, the actual subject that you're trying to shoot. And if they're not, then you just have to ignore them, walk away and find something that does. Now, one of the first decisions that you make whenever you're deciding how to frame a scene is which lens that you're going to use. Now, it's probably one of the most significant factors. The focal length that you use is going to play a significant part in defining how you compose the scene. And sometimes the most obvious choice isn't necessarily the best. You can be standing in front of this really epic vista and straight away your mind's telling you, oh, I need a wide angle because I really need to get it all in. But you can find that as soon as you put a wide angle lens on, then suddenly those mountains that look so impressive are pushed really far away and become really, really small in the scene. And the foreground right in front of you maybe isn't that interesting and it just fills up the entire bottom third of the image. So you really have to take a while to decide exactly what it is that you want to shoot, what are the elements in the landscape that are interesting, and what's the best focal length you can use for framing that. Now, I showed this image in the previous section, and the wide angle lens here is the wrong lens choice. It just makes the waterfall at the back too small and insignificant in the image. So this image manages to fail on multiple different levels. And it's the same with some of the other images that I showed in that section. Using a wide angle lens to fit so much of the scene in actually meant also including a lot of stuff that detracted from the image. So be aware that whenever you shoot with a wide angle, you're probably going to make whatever is your original subject, your focal point, is going to become much smaller in the frame, and you're going to be giving quite a lot of prominence to whatever is in the foreground and much closer to you. So you have to make sure that that foreground is both interesting and that it also supports the main subject, the main focus point of the image. But likewise, framing too tightly can also be just as much of a problem. If you're photographing mountains and you have them too close to the top of the frame, it starts to make them feel constricted and they're being pressed down. They lose a lot of the context that gives them scale. So whenever you're framing that's something that's not ultra wide, you have to make sure that you're giving enough breathing room around any of the major subjects in the frame, because without it, those subjects can start to feel cramped and diminished. One of the things that I think all good landscape images have is a sense of depth or three-dimensionality. It just makes them feel much more real. And without it, images can feel just a little bit flat. So it's something that I'm always looking to introduce in almost all of my images. Now, depth can be introduced in a number of ways, the most obvious of which is using a wide angle. You can see here in this image that without the image without the wide angle lens, it has no foreground. So while it's a very impressive subject, it just lacks depth and the whole scene feels very flat. But just by finding an interesting foreground here, that foreground just leads into the image and gives the whole scene a feeling of depth. Now, as I said in the previous section, it is very important when you're using a wide angle lens that the foreground you use has to be interesting. It has to support the image. You can't just, any boring old foreground isn't going to help in providing depth. So what you're trying to do if you're using a wide angle lens, if you're trying to use that to give depth to an image, is find an interesting foreground, something that supports the subject of the image and gives that feeling of depth, as though you can step right into the frame. And you can see that in some of these examples here. Now, if you're not using a wide angle lens with an interesting foreground, how then can you introduce depth into an image with, say, a telephoto lens? And the best way of doing that is with contrast. And for me, the best type of contrast is the contrast of light and shadow. Now, you can see here in these telephoto images from Namibia, or here from Norway, or from the Dolomites, how it works with the light contrasting with the shadow, giving the images depth. But even without direct light, you can find contrast using color, particularly if you're using a relatively minimal color palette. If you find just two contrasting colors, and then those colors tend to be the only colors in the scene, it can really make the image pop. One of the things that I see a lot, and I think really limits your ability to be able to get a really good composition, is by, when you're arriving at a scene, stopping and setting up your tripod and shooting from the first point at a location that you arrive at and not really exploring around it. Now, sometimes that can be because the location is relatively close to a parking spot, or sometimes it can be right at the end of a very long hike, and you get to the end of the hike and you see the view in front of you and you just stop, set up your tripod and start shooting. And what you don't do is just take the time, put your bag down, leave the camera in the bag, and then just walk around the scene, exploring the scene to find out if there are better compositions. Because statistically speaking, the chances of the best composition being from the point that you first arrive at is pretty rare. So I think it always pays off to just take some time walking around the scene, exploring and getting familiar with it, seeing what the subject is, seeing how it interacts with different elements, different foregrounds, and then finding the spot. Now, it's a real shame to arrive at a location and not take the time to explore it, especially if you've had to hike quite a way to get there, because there's always a good possibility that there's an excellent composition just around the corner that you're missing. This location in the Dolomites at Trecim, there's a trail to get here with a steep walk up to a saddle, and then the trail kind of continues to another part of the park. And people often just stop on the trail and shoot the mountains from there. But if you take the time to go off the trail and walk kind of back up this kind of scrambly path behind you, you get a much better, more elevated view. And from that point, you can also shoot compositions in different directions, which just gives you a whole different take on the scene. Now, another thing is setting up the tripod too soon after you arrive at a location. One thing that I've noticed is that as soon as you set up the tripod, then you're much less likely to move around and try to find different compositions, even if it's just going like 3 meters to the left or to the right. People generally tend to set their tripods up and pretty much stay like that, even to the point of not really moving up or down, lowering or going higher to see if different elevations give you a better composition. Now, these different compositions are all found by exploring the location, moving around and looking at different heights and different parts. So when you arrive at a scene, don't just set up your tripod as soon as you arrive there. Put your bag down. Take the time to walk around, look at the different spots, try different heights, getting closer to the ground, things like that, before you decide what your composition is going to be. Now, it's really tempting when we're out shooting to try to get images that look good on the back of the camera on the LCD screen. But what we should try to be doing, and what the mindset that we should have, is to be going home with the maximum amount and the best quality of data possible. And to do that, we should be really having the brightest image possible without clipping the highlights. Now, putting aside the fact that we can't really see the screen very well when we're out in the field anyway because of the light reflecting off it, And also the fact that the image that you're seeing on a screen is actually a JPEG that's embedded in the RAW file, and the histogram that you'll see will be from the JPEG. It is very, very hard to judge the quality of the image, the quality of the data in the image, just from looking at the image on the back of the camera. It might look great and punchy and contrasty, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to look good when you get it onto your computer screen and you start to try to process it. The thing to remember is that it's easier to add contrast and saturation to an image than it is to take it away. And brightening an image or lifting the shadows will always degrade the image or degrade that part of the image more than if you'd expose them correctly in the first place. Look at the difference between these two images. Now, this one was shot at the correct exposure and the other a little bit darker. And although that one looked great on the LCD screen, it's sort of contrasty and punchy, it is underexposed, and brightening it to the same level as the other images introduces noise. But if I go the other way and darken down the brighter image, that's not the case, and the image is much cleaner, the file is much cleaner, and it's going to look much better in print. So don't worry about getting an image that looks great on the LCD. It's much more important to go home with the maximum amount, the best quality of data possible, and to do that we expose to the right, get the brightest image possible without, of course, clipping the highlights. Now, I think it's really important when we're talking about mistakes to understand that we all make them and that we will all continue to make them. No one goes out into the field and nails every shot every time. Everybody goes home with far more failed images than they do with images that work. But I think the important thing is, whenever we're out shooting, to ask ourselves the questions: what are the mistakes that I've made before that I could be making again? What are the things that could be wrong with this image? Asking ourselves questions, because by doing that, we're on a pathway to making better images. And I think that's pretty much it for this video. I hope it's been useful and hope it's been interesting. If it has, please feel free to like and subscribe, because it really does help the channel. And if you enjoyed the video, if you enjoy my photography and the way that I talk about photography, I'd love to have you join me on a workshop. I lead workshops in some incredible places all over the world. Next year, we're going to be going to Namibia, to Patagonia, to Iceland, to Greenland, to the Dolomites. So if you'd like to join me, you can find full information on all my workshops on the website. So please just check that out and drop me an email if you've got any questions at all. So if there's anything that I've missed in the video that you'd like to know more about, just drop me a comment below and I'll get back to you. And as ever, good luck with all your photography, and I'll see you next time. Take care.